It's a real pleasure to be at this event today and here in Conway Hall. So, my talk follows quite neatly, I think, Mayor's talk. You'll notice that there's a lot that I agree with him about, and then some important things that we don't see quite eye to eye on. So I think we're setting ourselves up for some interesting discussions here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about 5 things. I'm going to make some brief remarks, firstly, about framing, about how we need to talk about what we're talking about here today. And that'll also be a kind of thread that runs through what I say thereafter. Then I'm going to say something a bit more substantive about denialism, climate denialism. And then I'm going to say something a bit more substantive about libertarianism. And I think I've solved the mystery of why libertarians are so inclined to be climate deniers. So that's something to look forward to. Then I'm going to offer a kind of positive, alternative way of seeing things, or proposal, which is my Guardians for Future Generations idea. And then I'm going to finish up with some brief final remarks about growth and the alternatives to growth. So, framing, this is something I think about a lot. I think it's very, very important. I think we started to get a sense of how it's important in Mayor's remarks and in some of the responses to those remarks. If you're interested in looking more at what I'm going to be saying in the next couple of minutes, then you might check out my website, Green Words Workshop, where I look into issues of framing in political communications. And also I'll just mention in passing that I have a report on this coming out quite soon with my think tank, Greenhouse. The report is called Post-Growth Common Sense, the idea being that we need a new common sense, a new way of communicating with ourselves and with each other about how to think of ourselves in the world. So, framing. The first point I want to make is that I think that the tag global warming and the tag climate change are both pretty disastrous ways of trying to talk about what we're trying to talk about here. Why? There's numerous ways of understanding why. You can start out with the fact that when people hear the phrase global warming, they think, oh, that sounds quite nice. And people often say things like, well, we could do with a bit of global warming around here. The term climate change is no better. It has the advantage that it doesn't allow people to respond straight away by saying, but not everywhere is warming all the time. And that it opens one up to thinking about some of the more chaotic effects of climate change, so-called. But it similarly sounds extremely harmless to people, and that's why, as revealed by Stephen Poole in his superb book, Unspeak, that's why it was chosen. People think that the term climate change has come to prominence and dominance because it's the way that scientists wish to talk about it, but actually, if you look into the history of it, a lot of the reasons why the term climate change became the dominant term for talking about what we're talking about have to do with people in the United States and Saudi Arabia wanting people not to be concerned about the issue and finding that talking about it in the frame of climate change was the frame least likely to evoke concern. So what would I propose? Well, I think that the key term here, which we really need to be using a lot more, is climate chaos and related terms. And I'll come back to this point in a moment. It seems to me that what's happened this past winter in this country has given us a real opportunity here. People are starting to wake up. They're being woken up by the weather chaos, which is, as is increasingly recognized, the result of climate chaos, to the reality of dangerous man-made climate change in a way that wasn't the case previously. And I think talking about climate chaos is a lot more evocative and a lot more accurate in terms of tying into that phenomenon which we've all been experiencing, or at least noticing, over the past few months. Other terms worth considering, runaway climate change has something to be said for it in relation to the kind of scenarios that Mayor was briefly sketching earlier. Another term which I've sort of come up with myself and which I think is worth using in certain particular contexts, as opposed to anthropogenic climate change or anthropogenic global warming. The term anthropogenic, a lot of ordinary people don't really know what it means. The term man-made is a little bit kind of heavy-handed and also potentially vulnerable to being accused of being sexist. So my suggestion is for people to consider the term human-influenced, which is a nice moderate term, very hard for anyone to object to, a good potential sort of wedge term if you're trying to have a discussion with somebody who is not extremely au fait with the reality of the climate science. So it seems to me it's very important for us to talk vividly about the problems that we're already experiencing and the much greater problems that will come down the road, as Maya was sketching. So to put it in a nutshell, we do indeed need to talk about the nightmare that we are currently breeding. But we also need to talk in terms of dreams as well. If we talk only in terms of nightmares, we're not going to get anywhere at all. And it seems to me that it's very reasonable to talk about a dream or a series of dreams in this context. One thing I would mention about today's program, I think we've got a lovely symmetry in that we start with Maya's talk. Maya, the creator of the idea of carbon rationing, which he very briefly outlined towards the end of his talk as a kind of logical consequence of the contraction and convergence proposal. The idea being that each person in any given country should have the same carbon ration. And Sachi Lloyd, in her most important novels, The Carbon Diaries, which are again at the stall at the back of the room, actually sketching a scenario that in the most believable way it's yet been done about how a country like Britain might actually come to adopt something like carbon rationing as a system, as public policy. And sketching in the course of that how that could be part of the transition to a better way of life, a better quality of life, which it seems to me is entirely compatible with significant reductions in aggregate carbon emissions and use of fossil fuels. If we turn from rampantly inegalitarian, growth manic, unchallengedly materialist society to a future society which is more localist, which is more concerned about quality of life rather than quantity of stuff, and which does that in part by means of policy instruments such as, I would suggest, agreeing here, of course, with Maya, carbon rationing, then it seems to me that we can start to sketch quite believably, as to some extent Sachi does in her superb books, a dream to counterbalance the nightmare which we're going to experience on a business-as-usual model. And a final initial point about framing, as Maya already implied, it seems to me that it's absolutely crucial that we focus society's attention and focus our attention more on future generations, on, as I like to call them, future people. Because I think the term future generations, I mean, it's got some good things going for it, like the sort of vaguely kind of Star Trek sort of illusion that people hear in it. But it's all rather sort of vague and amorphous, and that's actually the problem when it comes to thinking about future people, that we tend to think about them in this vague and amorphous way, and we say, yeah, well, they're not kind of here yet, they don't exist, and how can you harm someone who doesn't exist is a typical problem posed by somewhat obtuse philosophers who think about these matters. When you talk about future people, it concretizes the existence of those who are going to come after us, our descendants. There are going to be future people. There might not be quite as many as there should be if we completely mess things up, but there are going to be future people. Who exactly they are, we don't know yet, but they are going to exist just as people exist now and just as people existed in the past. And we need to try to make them, if you like, real to ourselves and start to see, at least in our imagination, their faces. By the way, it isn't necessarily essential to actually do this with regard to very distant future generations. It isn't necessarily essential to think in very concrete terms about future people in order to generate a serious degree of care for the future. What do I mean by saying that? Well, I'm working on the current argument at the moment, which I think is watertight, and if it is, and if it were to become more widely disseminated, I think it would have a very powerful effect. And the argument is this: everyone says, if you ask people, what do you care about the most? Most people will say, my children. But if you actually think deeply about what it is to care about your children, then of course it will immediately be clear to you that the overwhelming likelihood is that when you ask your children in due course what is the most important thing to them, then they will reply, my children, and so on and so on. Very quickly, this iteration means that if you really care about your children, then you must care about distant future people, about distant future generations. So anyone who is actually serious, and I believe that most people are serious in saying that they care for their children, must care. They are logically committed to caring about distant future people. And I think this is an extremely powerful point, and if people started to understand it, they would start to alter their behavior. Okay, so that's the first point, framing. All right, second point, the end of denialism. So I think this winter has been a game changer. I'm sure that Vicky will tell us more about this. The declarations that the Met Office made in February were, I think, extremely important and groundbreaking. And I think we saw this winter, for the first time in several years, the climate denialists being put seriously on the back foot. I don't know how many of you saw, for example, a Channel 4 news program at the height of the floods where one of the top conservative deniers and Nigel Farage, with their feet literally in water, were grilled by Gary Gibbon, old friend of mine and the political correspondent of Channel 4. And for the first time in years, they looked as though they weren't in control of their own agenda anymore, and that Farage's eyes were sort of shifty and kind of dodging from side to side. All his confidence had gone. This winter has been a game changer. It's woken a lot of people up. It hasn't woken everybody up, partly because of the imperfect media response to it. I think the BBC in particular has still got a lot of waking up to do, let alone, of course, the denialist, hard-right tabloid press of papers like The Express and so on. But I think there's been a significant shift, and I think we have to make the most of that. I think one thing we should constantly do is say, this kind of thing that I'm just saying, that there's been a significant shift. I think if people go around saying, oh, it's really disappointing that the BBC hasn't woken up more, or that the opinion polls haven't shown a greater shift towards caring the environment or understanding of the nature of dangerous man-made climate change or climate chaos, I think that's the wrong thing to do. I think what we need to do instead is to accentuate the positive on this point and say, there has been a significant shift. The world in this country has changed. This winter has been this country's equivalent of Typhoon Haiyan or of what happened in New Orleans in America. And I think that this leads into some ways in which we can take the initiative in showing the absurdity of the denialist position. I've got a nice analogy on this, which I'd like to offer you and offer up to you for your use. So imagine a cyclist, say, an athlete of some kind, could be a cyclist, who's taking lots of performance-enhancing drugs. Right? He's taking these drugs, taking these drugs, taking these drugs. He's found out. He's challenged on it. You're taking all these drugs, you won these races, it was illegitimate. What would we make of a cyclist who responded to these remarks by saying, hang on a minute, you can't connect directly with 100% certainty my victory in any one of these races with any particular one of these steroids that I took, so I'm innocent, I'll walk free. That's exactly the logical character of the argument of the denialists. Exactly. And I think once you get events like we've had this winter in Britain, it just starts to become boringly kind of obtuse, stupid, absurd, laughable, really, for people to go around saying the kind of thing that my imaginary cyclist would say. And this is one reason why a lot of the work I'm doing at the moment is on why we don't need to put as much emphasis as I think has been put in recent years on science in relation to climate and on evidence. Right? The emphasis should instead be put on precaution, and this is the work that I've been doing with Nassim Taleb in this area, on how radically unprecautious, reckless it is to throw more and more, to put the atmosphere on stronger and stronger steroids, as it were. Yeah? The emphasis should be on precaution and on what is a remotely sane response to the kind of phenomena we're now starting to see worldwide, including recently in Britain. So, the end of denialism. The end of libertarianism. Here's the mystery. Why are so many libertarians climate deniers? It's odd, it's prima facie odd, because libertarians like to pride themselves on being kind of hard-headed realists, on having a strong belief in the values of the Enlightenment, truth, objectivity, etc. They typically castigate postmodernists for this reason and relativists. They're very against New Age type thinking and pseudo-scientific voodoo, and yet they find themselves on the sides of the climate deniers. Why is this? Well, my suggestion is it's overdetermined. There's a number of reasons, and they all pile up and lead libertarians to abandon their usual obsession with truth, objectivity, and the like. So there are factors like, for example, that big coal funds libertarian leading think tanks. And as an intelligent man once said, it's very hard for someone to understand something if their salary depends on them not understanding it. So there's factors like that. There's factors like that libertarians love the free market. They love to let innovation and growth and so on let rip. And it's increasingly obvious, and I'll come back to this point, how this is incompatible with a sane response to the climate crisis. But there's another reason which is even deeper than those powerful reasons, and it's this. If you're a serious libertarian, if what you believe is that the most important thing of all is liberty, as Mayer kept on putting it quite rightly, I think, your inalienable right to do what you want, right? Then it's not only the case, it is the case, but it's not only the case that this is hard to square with having to accept constraints on your ability to fly and so on and so forth. What's the ultimate constraint on liberty? What's the ultimate thing that if one could somehow find a way of escaping it, one would be more freer than anyone had dreamed possible? Well, it's truth itself. Right? The ultimate constraint on liberty is the idea that there are truths out there which you cannot gainsay, which you are not free to ignore or change or make or remake. I'm reminded here of the wonderful, I mean, I say wonderful in a sort of ironic way, famous remark of someone in the Bush administration who, when having a conversation with another foreign policy analyst, and the foreign policy analyst said to them, "Oh yeah, but you can't do that because it's just not compatible with the facts on the ground. You know, you're running up against reality there." This Bush foreign policy person said, "Oh no, that's not how things are anymore. You know, we are not in the reality-based community anymore. We make our own reality." That is apparently a genuine quote. That is the way that libertarians would like to be able to think, right? Nothing will constrain my freedom, not even truth itself. Right? And that's why they cannot accept the intellectual expertise of philosophers, of scientists, of anybody who says to them, "I'm sorry, but there's this absolute constraint, right? There's this absolute constraint which you cannot get outside, to do with planetary limits, to do with the way the greenhouse effect works, and so on and so forth." They want to say, no, you don't tell me what to think. It's my inalienable right to think what I want. And therefore I choose to think something which is a little bit easier for me and a little bit more compatible with the rest of my beliefs and with the way I would like to see our economy organized. So that's my analysis there of how libertarianism finds itself in the absurd position of endorsing climate denial far too often. And I'm afraid my view on this is that libertarianism is the logical conclusion of, or the apotheosis of, liberalism. I think one of the things we have to do in response to the climate crisis is to rethink the intuitive attraction which many of us feel towards the philosophy of liberalism, insofar as what liberalism says is freedom is always a good thing, and human beings are quintessentially individuals. I want to say that both of those claims are not true. Human beings are quintessentially social animals, This is absolutely fundamental to who we are, and if we try to run away from it, we will destroy ourselves. And freedom is not always a good thing in the way that extremely graphically Maya was seeking to suggest to you. So I think we've come to the road for libertarianism and for liberalism, and we have to seek an alternative approach, an alternative way forward. My next point is my positive proposal, a post-liberal proposal. Guardians, what do I mean? Guardians for future generations, guardians for future people. We have to find a way, because our society has failed to find such a way to date, of radically overcoming the short-termism that is destroying us, and of taking seriously the interests, the needs of future people. We have to take care of them. And that runs, as I said earlier, through indefinitely many generations into the future. If you really care about your children, even just about them, you will care for the indefinitely distant future. And that will include, by the way, eventually pretty much the whole world, because of course your descendants may well be inhabiting other parts of the world. They'll be dealing with truly global problems, of which dangerous climate change is only the most pressing that we are as yet experiencing. So I came up with this idea, and it's present in a report that I wrote up for Greenhouse, my think tank, and that you can find for free on our website, of Guardians for Future Generations. My suggestion is there needs to be, as part of our democratic system, a kind of check that anything that we choose to do or any policy that we wish to bring in needs to be future-proofed. How should we go about doing this? Well, the way I started to think about this question was by thinking about the concept of the demos, or of the people, right? What democracy is supposed to be about. Maya mentioned that the nation's interests come first and trump the interests of future people too often. But my thought is that, just as Edmund Burke wonderfully said, a people is not a time slice. A people doesn't just exist right now. A people is something that extends over time, from the past into the future. And I would say the same of a nation, I would say the same of a species, whatever level of organization you wish to take. But I think the concept of a people is a useful one here, because that is what democracy is supposed to mean, the people governing. I agree wholeheartedly, by the way, that I think most of us are in agreement that we don't really have that in this country, but it is nevertheless an aspiration, and it's something that we try to strive towards. So what would it be for the people to govern? Well, my thought was, well, you have somehow to include future people in that. A future people is not just, a people is not just who is alive right now. You have to include future people. How are we going to do that? How are we going to allow future people to vote, say? Well, it's obviously not possible. But nevertheless, we could think about how to seek to represent them. And that was where I came up with the idea of guardians for future generations. People whose, if you like, job it is to seek to take care of and even to represent those who are going to come after us, future people, to the extent that it's possible. How should these people be picked? There are various ways in which one might imagine this happening. One might imagine the government appointing them. I think wouldn't have much legitimacy. One might imagine that they should be people who have shown themselves to be the kind of people who think well about the future and take future people seriously. For example, members of organizations in the Green movement or of the Green Party. That would be a little self-serving. So my conclusion was the only proper way to do it is by sortition, by random selection. In other words, by the principle that animates the jury system, a vital part of our democratic institutions ever since Magna Carta, which we are about to celebrate the 800th anniversary of, appropriately enough. So the guardians should be selected at random from among us to have the weighty responsibility put on them of them holding the rest of us to account and making sure that we don't do anything which can be seen, upon serious reflection, to be putting future people seriously at risk. What kind of questions would the Guardians consider? Well, I think they would consider the question of our energy systems, for example. So nuclear power has been mentioned. I don't know what the Guardians would decide, but I think that one thing one can safely say is that energy issues, and especially the nuclear issue, start to look very different when you start to take a truly long-term view. Right? Far too much of the debate around nuclear power is, how are we going to keep the lights on? What energy are we going to be burning in 10 or 20 or 40 years' time? If we're serious about thinking about future people, I say it again, you need to be thinking about distant future generations. Even if you're only serious about thinking about your own children, you need to be thinking about distant future generations. What is somebody in 200,000 years going to make of a nuclear waste dump from the 20th century? I don't know what, well, completely harmless, I hear. That's not my understanding of the science. And moreover, we have to think of a future in which there may have been untold civilizational growths and declines, societal breakdowns, perhaps, some of them perhaps consequent upon the kind of thing that Maya was talking about. What is a precautious policy? What is a caring policy towards distant future people in relation? What would they want us to have left behind? Would they be happy with cooling ponds and dumps of stuff that they don't even understand what it is, and so on and so forth? I'm not saying what the Guardians would decide. I'm just saying I think the issue looks different once you start to take a seriously long-term view. And finally, my final point. Another thing that I think the Guardians would be minded to consider is whether it is sane, whether it makes sense, whether it's in the interests of distant future people for us to seek to continue to grow and grow and grow the economy and eat more and more into the Earth's ecosystems. Let me put a couple of codicils on this. I'm talking about net growth here. So I'm not, for example, saying, well, it's obviously a bad thing to have more renewable energy because then you're growing the economy. What I'm suggesting is that, and I think this is elementary common sense, a post-growth society would be one in which, as you grew one sector of the economy, you shrunk others. And also I want to make clear that I'm talking primarily, at least in the first instance, about richer countries, about countries like our own. I'm not talking about very poor countries, though I think we should challenge the assumption made by an early questioner that it is necessary to develop everyone to the level of energy use that we currently have. It's not obvious that that's possible or compatible with one planet living. And of course, that once again takes us to the essence of the contraction convergence idea. The contraction part applies to people like us, right? Our energy use, our material throughput and so forth needs to be reduced. Others may rise and will converge at some equitable level, which is compatible with, and here's another crucial framing point, I think, one planet living, right? One planet living is, I think, a term that sums up very well what we're talking about. And of course, as I'm sure most of you know, in Britain right now, we're living as if we had about 3 planets. Actually, I think that's a gross underestimate, but at a minimum, about 3 planets. So, as Maya said earlier, and here again I'm agreeing with him, freedom is not indivisible, and rights are not all good. We need to get real about planetary boundaries. We need to get real about one planet living. That is going to require a post-growth perspective. We must be clear that it's the ecology, stupid. This is, of course, one reason why I'm in the Green Party, the only party that recognizes this fact. This is, again, and I'll end with this microscopic advert once again, what I'm arguing for in my post-growth common sense report, which will be presented at the People's Parliament at the end of the month, my greenhouse report. And other stuff on the net. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. My name is Peter Archibald. I just wanted to ask you, Rupert, on the denialism end, have you seen particular evidence that denialism is coming to a halt, Or do you feel perhaps that that's a complacent approach to very clever people with lots of resources who might just be burying themselves in the institutions that we thought were helping to address these problems, like the IPCC?
Yeah, that's an interesting point, your final remark there. I have noticed that starting to happen, and that's a very destructive phenomenon which is difficult to address. Look, I didn't want to say, I wasn't meaning to say there isn't anyone left who calls himself a denialist. I mean, that's obviously completely untrue. What I was meaning to say was, I think that denialism has taken a serious hit over the past few months in this country. And I think that the logical or intellectual credibility of denialism is really in the toilet now. I think that it's got a bigger problem than it had a few months ago, and I think that some of the suggestions or arguments that I've been making really show the nature of that problem. I would love to hear a libertarian trying to respond to what I just said about libertarianism, for example. I think that there's going to come a time when these people are going to be basically kind of laughed at, and I think it may not be very distant.
Isn't there a danger in that the swing between denialism and belief in the man-made global warming is dependent on how the weather is in a particular year? So we've had a really disruptive winter, yes, but what happens if it goes back to normal this year? And you had all the people, for example, during the polar vortex situation in America saying, oh, what happened to global warming? And then the poles swing against belief in global warming. But what happens if things normal? Isn't this sort of dependent on how the weather is at any particular time? And isn't that a bit of an issue?
Well, obviously, this isn't the only factor, but you're right, of course, it is a factor. But I guess this ramifies into what Vicky will be talking about. The fact is that what we've seen, and what we're going to see more and more of, is more and more of these reminders. Let's put it like that, right? It's going to become, there's going to be less and less kind of, if you like, calm, prosperous interglacials, and more crisis moments, more and more wake-up calls.
Just a quick word of support for the idea of the wane of denialism. There was a huge outcry a month or so ago about Nigel Lawson on the Today programme, engaging very weakly, in fact, with a proper scientist. And they were criticised by lots of people I know, including people who I wouldn't normally have expected to leap into this argument, and a parliamentary committee. When the IPCC report was published last week, he was remarkably quiet, and the BBC didn't trot him out, which I think is entirely a good thing.
Well, no, he had his advisor, Richard Toll, stump up the fake objections by saying he withdraws his name from the report. And that got all coverage.
Yes, I agree with both of you.
Thank you. I'm Bernard from Buckhurst Hill. Thank you for your work. I'd like to be a guardian. If you'll make me one, I'll be very happy to do that.
Excellent.
I was very frustrated at the last talk. I was hoping we would find time today to have a debate about the solution to global warming through Dyson dots. Dyson dots. Imagine a square kilometre of solar voltaic sail launched into orbit at somewhere near the Lagrange #1 point. And this will be reversible as well, but it will cost a lot of money. And we have the technology, we don't have the capacity to do it. I'd like to have the debate sometime today, if possible.
Is what you're talking about there geoengineering to reflect the sun's energy away? Yeah. Well, yeah, I think that it's very unclear that any of these schemes are going to work. I think they're very unprecautious. I think they're very reckless. I think that if we're going to talk about geoengineering at all, it would be better to talk about ways of sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. I do think that there is a case for having the discussion about geoengineering at this point. I didn't used to think that. I used to think that this was a distraction, a dangerous distraction against the most crucial conversation, which is about how to mitigate, reduce, etc. But that was before I saw the psychological evidence, such as it is, which suggests quite interestingly that when you have a conversation with people about geoengineering, it helps to wake them up, basically. Basically, the response which a lot of people have when there are serious discussions about geoengineering, I mean just ordinary citizens, is, oh my God, if they're talking about things as drastic and extreme and so on as this, then the problem must be real, right? It radically counters the way in which governments have disastrously framed dangerous climate change as an individual kind of liberal problem, you must change your own light bulbs, etc., which implicitly makes people think, oh, this isn't really serious. If all they're asking us to do is change a few light bulbs, then this is no big deal. So I think it is worth having the conversation about geoengineering. In terms of the content of the conversation, though, I remain pretty skeptical.
Make a scientific comment about geoengineering in terms of trying to alter the climate to counteract climate change. Yeah, we don't really understand enough about the climate system now.
Yep.
And I'll talk about this in relation to the weather that we experienced this winter. To think that we can change something and really understand what it's going to do is very dodgy, I think. It's,
yeah.
As you say, it's worth having the conversation, but you need to understand that. And also there's a whole question about equity as well. If you do something to improve the climate in one part of the world, it's almost certain to make it worse somewhere else. And if you've deliberately done that, you could then actually how do you address those governance issues? It's much more difficult than reducing greenhouse gases, and we know how difficult that is.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Vicky. I totally agree. On the first point is, I think, absolutely crucial. That is again the work that Nassim Taleb and I are doing. I think that geoengineering is radically unprecautious, and I think that it puts us surreptitiously in a position of even more extreme earth management or anthropogenic kind of hubris than we are currently in. It's basically the idea that we can, as it were, extract ourselves from the world and control the entire world system. This is a fantasy, but it is a particularly extreme version of the very fantasy which has got us into the problem that we're now in. And that suggests to me quite strongly that it's moving in the wrong direction rather than the right direction. If you want the kind of deep philosophical background to this, then the person to read is Heidegger. In terms of someone who's written about this quite strongly in a more sort of concrete, present-oriented way, then the person to read is Clive Hamilton in his book. I think it's called Earth Masters, which the title of which kind of, I think, nicely shows you the kind of worry that I'm meaning to allude to there.
Hi. I like the idea of guardians. I guess my concern is about knowing, if you look backwards at decisions people have taken for future generations some time ago that have not always turned out to be better for future generations because of lack of knowledge or understanding.
Yeah.
And how, therefore, do you ensure equity between generations if we don't even know what it is that we're thinking about for those distant future people and what that world is going to be like?
Yeah.
So you end up denying something for the current generation, which actually hasn't then improved or isn't equitable with what you're doing with distant generations.
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. And what would be unfortunate would be if the guardians or anybody were to try to sort of would-be kind of fine-tune the future in the way that some geoengineering proposals imagine, in a way which is hubristic, in a way which radically fails to take into account the inherently unpredictable nature of human action and of social action and of what Taleb calls grey swans and black swans. My view about this is that, well, firstly, what the guardians should do is only do things within the limits of their own knowledge or capacities. So what does that mean, for example? One thing it means, for example, is that the very distant future will have to take care of itself. So we might think, for example, in relation to nuclear power, we might think, if there's a problem with long-lasting nuclear waste, we ought to take that into account. We ought to think seriously about what's going to be happening with these materials 5,000 or 100,000 years from now. But in terms of thinking 100 million years into the future, I don't think there's anything we can do, right? So to take it to the extreme, ultimately, it's quite likely that life on Earth will be ended by the sun becoming a supergiant. Should the Guardians be concerning themselves about how to avert that? No. They should just not try and do anything about it at all. So that's the first point. The second point would be that I would suggest that a fundamental aspect of the way that the Guardians or anybody thinking about this should think, once again, is based in precaution. So it's not about trying to think, oh, let's try and model, extrapolate, etc., work out what the future is going to be like. It's not based on prediction as such, right? It's based on what should we not do in order to reduce future risks and uncertainties. How can we build down risks? How can we build down uncertainties? That would be a fundamental recommendation of mine to governments. It's also, I would hope, the way that the Guardians would think. Obviously, I can't guarantee that, but as part of my guide's proposal, and you can read all about this if you want to in the report on the Greenhouse website, one of the things I suggest is that the Guardians would have a sort of a kind of initial and then perhaps ongoing kind of training and sort of education program where they would learn stuff about the future, the threats to the future, how to think about the future, etc. And I would have thought that a crucial element of what they would learn would be how to think precautiously and how to act precautiously.
Question. There are about 100 million people in Nigeria who live on about $1 a day. What's the green agenda to address that in the context of people using less? And just let me add one slight thing about Nigeria. The generating power connected to the grid, and you have to be very careful about this because most people generate their electricity for themselves, but the grid supplies 8 watts per head of Nigerians. That's the install power. You can only get, if people use more than 8 watts on average, there's no electricity to go around. And so it's quite a challenge for your green agenda, I think.
Okay, well, it's a big and complicated question. I can only hope to answer one or two aspects of it. So firstly, a remark about the grid. I don't think we should think of the grid as the be-all and end-all. I think in the future we will gradually start to move away from having one national grid in this country, and we will have more decentralized energy systems and local grids. One of the ways that will happen, as it's starting to happen in some continental European countries, is through community-owned renewable energy schemes, which sadly we have a pitiful number of in this country because of terrible government policies, primarily in this area. So I think that we shouldn't bet the farm on grids. But of course, at the present time, your question remains largely valid. How would I address that? Well, clearly part of the way I'd address it is once again through renewable energy. One of the best ways, and there have been quite a few interesting recent reports on this, one of the best ways of lifting people from poverty in third world countries is through giving them solar technology, passive solar technology, and so on and so forth. And I think that would certainly apply in Nigeria. But perhaps you also had in mind my remark that I don't think we should accept the development model at face value. That's a large and complicated discussion. Just a couple of quick remarks on it. Firstly, do bear in mind the repeated cautions that I made to the effect that when I'm talking about a post-growth society, for example, I'm in the first instance talking about what we should do. Right? And contraction and convergence has built into it the idea that you're going to allow plenty of poorer societies around the world to continue to develop while we build down our emissions and our impacts and so that we converge. But secondly, as I said, I think that there is something potentially dangerous and misleading about saying, oh, they're living on $1 a day, it's so terrible. Let me give you a little analogical case from Helena Norberg Hodge's superb book, Ancient Futures, which I heartily recommend anyone who hasn't read it to read. Ancient Futures, Norberg Hodge's idea is that part of what we need to have in our future is stuff that we had really well in our past and that we've since abandoned. And she criticizes the standard development model because she said it makes everybody who has $1 a day think that they are poor and lacking in something. So she gives an interesting anecdote of the first time she visited Ladakh, which is like the sort of Indian little bit of Tibet. And she found, and she met a young man who was perfectly happy and living in a more or less self-sufficient way on his farm. She went back to Ladakh several years later and met the same man in the biggest city in Ladakh. And he was begging and saying to her and passers-by, "Oh, please help us Ladakhis. We're so poor. We're all so poor here." What had happened in the meantime? Well, what had happened in the meantime was basically that Western corporations and materialist values, etc., had started to infiltrate Ladakh, such that people who had been self-sufficient and had perfectly good lives suddenly thought, "Oh my God, I'm really poor. I'm lacking in all this stuff that I need to have. You know, I've got to have that cigarette lighter and those new jeans and so on and so forth." So on the one hand, I totally endorse the idea that there are plenty of poor people in the world who shouldn't be poor, and that we should allow and encourage and facilitate significant portions of the world to develop. But I think we should also question the development paradigm. The idea, for example, that we are a developed nation and that others are developing, that they are and should be trying to become like us. This is a completely absurd, hubristic idea, which is based in Western imperialism and ethnocentrism, and we need to move beyond it. And moving beyond it, and thinking of the kind of options that Helena Norberg-Hodge opens up to us in a book like Ancient Futures, is part of the way forward.
Could I just briefly go back to the Guardian's issue?
Please.
It's a very nice idea that we're looking after future people. It occurs to me that future people are probably going to be as divided by class, wealth, nationality as we are now. So it's a question of which future people will get priority and so forth. As an example, in the train coming up, I read a review of a book called Windfall, the Booming Business of Global Warming. It basically says Wall Street has woken up to climate change not as a problem, but as an opportunity. All sorts of technologies, insurances, etc. So those people will have their future descendants. I think it's a very nice idea of Guardians, and I agree with it, but there's problems as well.
Yeah, I think you're right. That's a good kind of reality check. But there is a couple of kind of important mitigatory factors. So, and I alluded to them during my talk. So one is this. Go back to the thought that those people you're talking about, for example, care about their children. Maybe they think to themselves, "Oh, I want my children to have a good future, so I'm going to make them nice and rich," and stuff like that. Well, when climate chaos really, if and when climate chaos, runaway climate change really rips in, there aren't going to be many places for those children or for their children to hide in. When one starts to think seriously about taking care of the future, it becomes increasingly clear that one has to think about the whole world, because the problems that are going to affect the more distant future are largely, not exclusively, but largely increasingly global problems. They are threats to breaches of our planetary limits in an alarmingly globalized world. Another aspect of this, right? Again, thinking about caring about your children. So, say you have two children, and they have two children, they have two children, you look like you've got a kind of line going to the future. But of course, as anyone who's seen a family tree knows, a family tree goes like this. It comes into the present moment. Right, if you're at the center of your own family tree, and then it goes out and spreads out, spreads out. It has like roots, as it were, going out and out and out into the future. The further you go into the future, right, the higher number of descendants you have, and the wider spread they are likely to be around the world. So once again, if your Wall Street industrialists are serious about thinking, I want to take care of my children, then they ought to care for the distant future, and they ought to care for the entire world. And if people actually started to think about that and understand it, again, I think it would alter their behavior.
Yeah, it's a good place to finish, so round of applause again.